Hi, this is Dr. Gregory Sadler. I'm a professor of philosophy and the president and founder of an educational consulting company called Reason.io, where we put philosophy into practice. I've studied and taught philosophy for over 20 years, and I find that many people run into difficulties reading classic philosophical texts. Sometimes it's the way things are said or how the text is structured. But the concepts themselves are not always that complicated, and that's where I come in. To help students and lifelong learners, I've been producing longer lecture videos and posting them to YouTube. Many viewers say they find them useful. What you're currently watching is part of a new series of shorter videos, each of them focused on one core concept from an important philosophical text. I hope you find it useful as well. In Problema 1 of Fear and Trembling, Abraham is going to make a vital distinction between Abraham, understood as the father of faith and this solitary figure, and the tragic hero. Now, one might be tempted to read this as an opposition between Athens and Jerusalem, philosophy and faith, or Greek culture and Hebrew literature and culture, and that would be completely wrong. Why would that be wrong? It's not a clash between Christianity and paganism, because one of the figures who he's going to discuss as a tragic hero is somebody right out of the Old Testament, one of the judges, Jephthah. No, the fault line here runs in a different direction. And before we go on, let me mention that the three heroes that he's talking about in this section are taken from Greek, Roman, and Hebrew literature and history, right? Agamemnon, Jephthah, and Brutus. Why pick those three? You might say that Kierkegaard is covering all of the bases of classic antiquity, the things that flowed most steadily, not exclusively, but had the greatest impact upon the development of Western thought. So by addressing them, he is, like I said, covering his bases. He also mentions Shakespeare, showing us that somebody who's more contemporary is dealing with tragic heroes. And he says, why didn't Shakespeare have any characters like Abraham in them? Later on, he's also going to discuss Socrates and how Socrates functions as a sort of tragic hero, less in action and more in the realm of thought, but of course sacrificing his own life for philosophy. So how are the tragic heroes different from somebody like Abraham? This is connected with this notion of teleological suspension of the ethical, and it's very useful for us to think in terms of these stages or perspectives that Kierkegaard sets out in relation to each other. The aesthetic is not going to be discussed very much here. That is the realm of particular individuals, and they aren't recognizing the universal in the way that the ethical is. Instead, they're living their lives and maybe making money, enjoying themselves, indulging themselves in certain things, pursuing certain telos, tele, ends, goals, purposes, but those that are germane to themselves. And when we find something, as we say, bigger than ourselves that we belong to, that helps place things into context for us, whether that be something intellectual, whether that be something involved in action, whether that be a cause, we find ourselves in the realm of what Kierkegaard is calling the ethical. There's something universal that we recognize. And Abraham has this. For Abraham, as Kierkegaard points out, the ethical would be his family, and indeed the promise that God has made of many nations being blessed through him. But it's primarily the small community that is his family, as a set of individuals in relation to each other. He's supposed to love them. That is part of the ethical for him. Now, why would we bring up tragic heroes? It's possible to distinguish levels within the ethical. So it's not just a matter of the religious versus the ethical versus the aesthetic. There are higher and lower, we might say, levels, each with their own telos, their own purpose, their own goal, that can be recognized within the ethical. And some of our moral development and a lot of our moral conflicts, in fact, depend upon this. So he says the tragic hero is still within the ethical. He allows an expression of the ethical to have its telos in a higher expression of the ethical. That's a very important point there. And the reason why Kierkegaard actually brings up these three guys, Agamemnon, Jephthah, and Brutus, is because each one of them does an act similar in description to what Abraham is contemplating doing with Isaac, namely sacrifices or kills their own child. Why would somebody kill their child? We might think of all sorts of criminal reasons that a person might kill their child for. Say, think about the case of Medea in antiquity, where she essentially is killing her children to spite her husband who is cheating on her. And this is looked at as a horrible act by everybody in antiquity. And the only debate about it is how culpable is she in doing this and how much blame does Jason bear. But it's understood as a violation of the ethical. Could there be situations in which one actually does need to sacrifice one's child? And Kierkegaard says yes. There can be a higher expression of the ethical. He says the tragic hero scales down the ethical relation between father and son, or daughter and father, to a feeling that has its dialectic in its relation to the idea of moral conduct. What is that idea of moral conduct? This is something that is needed for the larger community. And in the case of Agamemnon, it has to do with the ships being able to sail to Troy. There's this entire fabric of Greek society that is dependent upon the sacrifice of this unfortunate person. Jephthah, he makes a rash vow to God in order to win victory for the people of Israel against their oppressors, that he will sacrifice the first thing that comes to meet him when he gets home. Turns out that it's his daughter. Brutus has a son who doesn't do what he's supposed to do and rather does the opposite and has to be executed by his own father who does it. And these are viewed as a higher expression of the ethical. There is still some telos, some point within it, and it has to do with the good of the community. So the tragic hero is indeed somebody who is, in some sense, doing the right thing. And notice what he says about this. When in the crucial moment, Agamemnon, Jephthah, and Brutus heroically have overcome the agony, heroically have lost the beloved. They love their children, but they recognize that they have to kill them. They have only to complete the task externally. There will never be a noble soul in the world without tears of compassion for their agony, of admiration for their deed. And he says what they don't do is what Abraham does. What does Abraham do? This is part of it. He says, if in the crucial moment these three men were to append to the heroic courage with which they bore the agony the little phrase, but it will not happen anyway, who then would understand them? If they went on to explain, this we believe by virtue of the absurd, who would understand them any better? Yet that is what Abraham is, according to Kierkegaard, doing. Abraham has faith in God that somehow, by virtue of the absurd, this is all going to work out, that anything is possible for God, and he believes that God is in fact demanding the sacrifice of his child, not for a community, but for something beyond the ethical. So, in the case of the tragic hero, the person who sacrifices for the good of their community, what they do is understandable. It moves within the realm of what Kierkegaard calls the universal. Any one of us, we don't want to step into their place, but we could if we actually possess the courage and the moral fiber that they have We could do that, and it would make sense. Likewise, it could be Socrates allowing the city of Athens to execute him and choosing not to flee his prison cell when the guards have been bribed so that he can take a stand for the practice of philosophy and the pursuit of wisdom. Again, there's some sort of universal human value there. And we might think of countless tragic heroes in our own time doing similar things, recognizing that they may in fact fail, but taking on those challenges anyway in ways that we can understand, recognize, replicate, perhaps. So that's the realm of the tragic hero. That's the realm of the ethical. Abraham goes beyond that. He is involved in what Kierkegaard points to as a higher telos. What is the higher telos in this case? He tells us in the text that it is fulfilling the will of God. Now, some people might view the will of God as something that is just within the realm of the ethical, and quite often within, not just paganism, but within both Judaism and Christianity, that's how it's understood. Kierkegaard will actually say that a church is really no different than a state in this respect. But there will be some individuals, and he uses Abraham, he also talks about Mary, and he talks about Jesus and his disciples, for whom there is a higher call that introduces a greater telos that has to be answered to, and which does not provide you with a justification that other people will be able to understand, because there is the absurd involved there. So he says, Abraham's situation is a case in which he transgresses the ethical altogether and had a higher telos outside of it. He goes on and he says that, why does Abraham do it? For God's sake. And the two are wholly identical, for his own sake. He does it for God's sake because God demands this proof of his faith. He does it for his own sake so he can prove it. And that is as much explanation as we're really going to get. So what else do we find? Kierkegaard will talk about, he brings this catchphrase up over and over again, the anxiety, the distress, the paradox. That is something within the realm of the religious. The tragic hero may endure some agony, but they can say it is for the best of the community. It is fulfilling the telos that I recognize, the higher one. They sacrifice the lower to the higher. Abraham goes beyond that, places himself in an absolute relation to the absolute as an individual, not mediated through the universal as the tragic hero does. So this is a vital distinction that Kierkegaard is making here in Problema 1 of Fear and Trembling.